August 13th, 1944. Argentan, France. General George Patton stands over a map table with more than 100,000 German soldiers trapped in a shrinking pocket less than 20 miles to his north, and he is asking his superior officer for permission to close the door before they escape. Patton's Third Army, tearing across France at a speed that has stunned Allied planners and German commanders alike, has just seized Argentan far ahead of schedule. George Smith Patton Jr., 58 years old, is by this point in the war one of the most famous and most controversial American generals in uniform, a cavalry officer turned tank commander whose aggressive, relentless style of armored warfare has already made him a household name in the United States, even as his volatile temperament and history of public controversy, including a notorious incident in which he slapped a shell-shocked soldier in a Sicilian field hospital the previous year, have made him a source of constant anxiety for his superiors. Eisenhower, in particular, has long recognized Patton's brilliance as a battlefield commander, while remaining acutely aware of the political risk his impulsiveness represents, a tension that runs directly through the decision now unfolding at Argentan. To the north, Canadian and Polish forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group are pushing south toward the town of Falaise, driving what remains of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army into an ever-tightening pocket of French countryside. If American and Canadian forces can link up, sealing the narrow gap still separating them, they will trap the core of Hitler's Western military strength in a single, catastrophic encirclement, the kind of decisive, war-shortening victory that could end organized German resistance in France within days. Military planners on both the American and Canadian sides recognize immediately that an opportunity of this magnitude arises rarely in modern warfare. Entire field armies, rather than isolated divisions or corps, trapped in open country with limited prospect of relief from outside the pocket, presenting a chance not merely to defeat the German forces in Normandy, but to annihilate them outright as an organized fighting force. Patton believes his tanks can close that gap in a matter of hours. He is asking Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group and his direct superior, for permission to keep driving north. What Bradley decides in the hours that follow will become one of the most fiercely debated command decisions of the entire Second World War, a choice that some historians credit with preventing a catastrophic friendly fire collision, and others blame for allowing tens of thousands of German soldiers to escape a trap that was, for one brief moment, almost completely closed. Few single decisions made by any Allied commander during the entire European campaign have generated as much sustained argument in memoirs, staff college seminars, and popular histories alike as the choice Bradley makes on this single August morning. To understand why this single decision carries such enormous weight, you have to understand how completely the German position in Normandy has collapsed in the 3 weeks since Bradley launched Operation Cobra south of Saint-Lô. What began in late July as a breakout from 7 weeks of grinding hedgerow warfare has, by the second week of August, become a rout. Patton's Third Army, activated on August 1st, has raced across Brittany and then wheeled east and north, with a speed that echoes the blitzkrieg tactics the German army itself once used to conquer France in 1940. In barely 2 weeks, Third Army units have covered distances that, measured against the grinding, yard-by-yard pace of the earlier Normandy fighting, seem almost to belong to an entirely different war, forward elements sometimes advancing 40 or 50 miles in a single day against crumbling, disorganized German resistance. German Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding German forces in the west, finds his armies increasingly encircled as American forces sweep south and east, while British, Canadian, and Polish forces under Montgomery press down from the north. Kluge himself is operating under almost impossible constraints, caught between the collapsing military reality in front of him and the fanatical demands of a Führer who refuses to accept that the battle in Normandy is already lost. Communications between Kluge's headquarters and the scattered, disorganized remnants of his own field armies grow increasingly unreliable as Allied air power devastates German supply lines and command posts, leaving many German unit commanders to make critical decisions about retreat or resistance, with only fragmentary information about the wider collapse unfolding around them. Adolf Hitler, refusing to authorize the general withdrawal his own field commanders are desperately requesting, has instead ordered a counterattack toward Mortain, a last, doomed effort to cut through American lines and reach the coast, an offensive that fails catastrophically and leaves German panzer divisions dangerously overextended, precisely positioned for the encirclement now taking shape around them. The Mortain counterattack, launched on August 7th with 4 panzer divisions Hitler insisted must drive west to the sea, regardless of the mounting risk to their own flanks, is broken within days by determined American defense and devastating Allied air attacks, further weakening the very forces Kluge desperately needs to hold open an escape route for the armies now trapped further east. By committing his armor to an offensive gamble, rather than preserving it for the defensive fighting withdrawal his generals recommend, Hitler has, in effect, helped construct the very trap now closing around his own forces in Normandy. By August 13th, the shape of that encirclement has become unmistakable. German forces, an estimated 100,000 or more soldiers, along with irreplaceable tanks, artillery, and vehicles, are compressed into a pocket roughly 35 miles long and at its narrowest point, barely 15 miles wide, bounded by Falaise to the north and Argentan to the south. Inside this shrinking perimeter sit the remnants of some of the German army's most storied formations, including elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, the 2nd Panzer Division, and the once formidable Panzer Lehr Division, all badly depleted by weeks of continuous fighting, but still capable of inflicting serious casualties on any force attempting to close the trap around them. Patton's 15th Corps, under the aggressive command of Major General Wade Hyslop, has advanced with such speed that it has reached Argentan nearly 2 days ahead of what any planner could reasonably have anticipated, catching even Patton's own superiors somewhat off guard. Hyslop's corps, comprising the US 5th Armored Division, the US 79th Infantry Division, and the French 2nd Armored Division under General Philippe Leclerc, the same French division that will lead the liberation of Paris less than 2 weeks later, has covered extraordinary distances in a matter of days, moving with a speed more characteristic of the German blitzkrieg tactics of 1940 than anything the grinding Normandy campaign has produced up to this point. Leclerc's French troops, fighting to liberate their own homeland after 4 years of German occupation, bring a particular ferocity and urgency to the advance, a motivation that Hyslop and his American commanders recognize and, in the rush toward Argentan, do little to restrain. Canadian First Army forces under Lieutenant General Harry Crerar are still fighting their way toward Falaise from the north, encountering stubborn German resistance that is slowing their advance considerably. Crerar's forces, including the I Canadian Corps and the 1st Polish Armored Division under Major General Stanisław Maciek, launch repeated attacks against determined German defenses anchored around Falaise itself, defenses manned by battered but still dangerous elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, and other units fighting with the particular ferocity of soldiers who understand that encirclement, and likely destruction, awaits them if the pocket closes. Progress toward Falaise proves far slower and costlier than Allied planners had anticipated, a sobering reminder that even a German army in the final stages of collapse can still inflict brutal casualties on the forces closing in around it. Between Hyslop's forward positions at Argentan and the Canadians still fighting south of Falaise lies a gap of somewhere between 15 and 20 miles, open country, thinly held, through which the entire remaining strength of 2 German armies could yet escape if the Allies fail to seal it in time. Patton, characteristically brash and utterly convinced of his own army's capability, believes closing this gap is well within reach. He has already told his staff that his tanks could drive to Falaise and meet the Canadians within a matter of hours, sealing the trap and delivering what could be the single most decisive tactical victory of the entire war in the West. His confidence is not entirely unfounded. Third Army's advance across France over the previous 2 weeks has repeatedly outpaced even the most optimistic staff projections, and Patton has built a well-earned reputation for accomplishing exactly the kind of rapid, aggressive maneuver he is now proposing. But the decision is not his to make alone. Army group boundaries, agreed upon at the highest levels of Allied command, place Argentan at the edge of American operational authority, with the ground beyond it assigned to Montgomery's forces advancing from the north. For Patton to push further, he needs explicit authorization from Bradley, and Bradley, holding the telephone at his headquarters, is about to make a decision that will be picked apart by historians for the next 80 years. Does Bradley say yes and gamble on a high-speed dash into a chaotic, fast-moving battlefield where Allied units from two different national commands are converging on the same narrow strip of ground? Or does he say no and risk watching more than 100,000 German soldiers slip through a gap that, for one fleeting moment in August 1944, was almost within America's grasp to close? The clock is already running, the German columns already beginning to shift eastward under cover of darkness, and whatever Bradley decides in the next few hours will be nearly impossible to reverse once his forces are committed one way or the other. On the morning of August 13, 1944, Bradley receives Patton's request with the full weight of its implications bearing down on him immediately. Haislip's 15th Corps, spearheaded by the 5th Armoured Division and the French 2nd Armoured Division under General Philippe Leclerc, sits at Argentan, having advanced so quickly that its own flanks are dangerously exposed, its supply lines stretched thin after days of relentless pursuit. Bradley receives the request not through a leisurely staff discussion, but amid the general chaos of a headquarters trying to track a rapidly evolving, multi-front battle across an area of France stretching for hundreds of miles, with reports arriving from American, British, Canadian, and French units simultaneously, each describing a different piece of a battlefield picture that is changing by the hour. Bradley knows that Patton wants to keep driving north immediately, closing what both men can see, on the map in front of them, is a genuinely narrow gap. But Bradley also knows something Patton, focused entirely on the tactical opportunity in front of him, may be underweighting. The operational chaos of two massive army groups, American and Canadian, converging on the same narrow strip of French countryside from opposite directions, with artillery, air support, and armoured columns all operating in close proximity, communicating across different national commands, different radio frequencies, and different reporting procedures. Bradley's chief concern, by his own later account, is the very real risk of a catastrophic friendly fire disaster, American and Canadian forces mistaking each other for the retreating German army in the confusion of a fast-moving, converging battle, a fear made viscerally immediate by the memory of Operation Cobra's own friendly fire tragedy at Saint-Lô just 3 weeks earlier, when American bombs killed more than 100 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair. That memory is fresh, and it weighs heavily on a commander who has already watched, firsthand, what happens when converging Allied firepower goes wrong. The prospect of American Sherman tanks and Canadian or Polish armoured columns approaching each other head-on across unfamiliar terrain, with limited coordination between separate national commands operating on different radio networks and different reporting procedures, strikes Bradley as a recipe for exactly the kind of tragedy that has already scarred his command once this campaign. Compounding the difficulty, aerial reconnaissance and battlefield reporting, in a rapidly shifting, multinational engagement of this kind, are notoriously unreliable, and Bradley has no confident way of knowing, hour by hour, exactly where Canadian and Polish spearheads actually sit, relative to Haislip's own forward positions, a fog of war that makes any high-speed dash toward a link-up considerably more dangerous than it appears on a static map. Bradley is also acutely aware that Haislip's corps, already extended well beyond its planned limit of advance, would be pushing into terrain assigned to Montgomery's 21st Army Group, a violation of the carefully negotiated command boundaries that govern how American and British Commonwealth forces operate alongside one another, boundaries that exist precisely to prevent the kind of confusion Bradley fears. Bradley makes his decision that same day. He orders Haislip's 15th Corps to halt at Argentan rather than continue pushing north to close the gap. Instead of driving forward to link up with the Canadians, American forces are instructed to hold their positions, adopting what Bradley later describes as a defensive posture designed to block German forces attempting to escape south through Argentan itself, while leaving the final sealing of the pocket to Montgomery's forces advancing from the north. The order is transmitted down the chain of command within hours, reaching Haislip's own headquarters while his forward units are still poised, engines idling, awaiting the go-ahead to continue the drive north that Patton has already all but promised them. Patton, informed of the decision by telephone, argues forcefully against it, reportedly telling Bradley that his forces could push to Falaise and complete the encirclement within a single day, sealing the gap before German forces have any real opportunity to organize a coordinated withdrawal. Bradley, unmoved, holds firm, telling Patton in terms that leave no room for further debate that the Corps is to remain at Argentan and consolidate its position, rather than press further north into ground assigned to Montgomery's forces. It is a conversation that both men will remember and recount, very differently for the rest of their lives. Patton as a moment of maddening, unnecessary caution that cost the Allies a complete victory. Bradley as a sound, defensible judgment, made with the safety of thousands of soldiers, American and Canadian alike, weighing on every word. It is a decision made under enormous time pressure, based on imperfect information about exactly how fast Crérar's Canadians can fight their way to Falaise, and it is a decision that immediately, visibly frustrates Patton, who believes, and will continue to believe for the rest of his life, that his tanks could have closed the gap in a single day, trapping the German armies completely before they had any chance to organize an escape. What follows over the next week is one of the most agonizing near misses of the entire war. Canadian and Polish forces, fighting through determined German rearguard actions, do not actually capture Falaise itself until August 16th, and it takes several more days of brutal fighting before Polish and Canadian units finally link up with American forces and seal the gap completely, on or around August 21st. Each day the gap remains open. Allied commanders monitoring the situation grow increasingly aware of the widening chasm between the trap's original promise and its actual execution. Intelligence reports tracking the steady stream of German vehicles and soldiers still slipping eastward each night, a slow hemorrhage that no amount of subsequent air attack can fully stop once the initial window for a swift, complete closure has passed. The final days of that closing operation produce one of the most extraordinary and, for decades, under-recognized feats of the entire Normandy campaign: the stand of the 1st Polish Armored Division at a hill known as Mont Ormel, which Polish soldiers themselves nickname Machuga, or the Mace, for its distinctive shape. From August 19th through August 21st, roughly 1,500 Polish soldiers under Maczek's command hold this critical high ground overlooking the last remaining escape corridor, cutting off the primary route German forces are using to flee eastward and enduring repeated, desperate German counterattacks, launched specifically to reopen the escape route the Poles have severed. Surrounded, low on ammunition, and taking casualties from German forces attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, the Polish defenders hold their position for 3 days against attacks that grow increasingly frantic as German commanders recognize that Mont Ormel represents one of the last remaining paths to safety for tens of thousands of their own trapped soldiers. When relief finally arrives on August 21st, the Polish division has suffered hundreds of casualties, but has held the ground, playing a decisive role in finally sealing the pocket that Bradley's halt order at Argentan had left open more than a week earlier. In the days between Bradley's halt order and the final closure of the pocket, German forces conduct a desperate, chaotic evacuation through the narrowing corridor still open between Argentan and Falaise, retreating under nearly continuous Allied air attack, abandoning tanks, artillery, and vehicles by the thousands as roads become so choked with wreckage and dead horses. The German army still relies heavily on horse-drawn transport for supply, that retreating soldiers are forced to continue on foot, clambering over the twisted metal remains of their own army's equipment. German officers attempting to organize an orderly withdrawal find their efforts constantly undermined by the sheer physical congestion clogging every available road, single narrow country lanes forced to accommodate the retreat of what remains of 2 entire field armies, creating traffic jams so severe that vehicles sit stationary for hours at a time, perfect, motionless targets for the Allied aircraft circling constantly overhead. Allied fighter bombers, flying continuous sorties over what soon becomes known as the Falaise Gap, or, to some who witness its aftermath, the corridor of death, inflict horrific casualties on the retreating columns. Rocket-firing Typhoon aircraft of the Royal Air Force and P-47 Thunderbolts of the American 9th Air Force take turns pounding the choked roads throughout the daylight hours of August 18th, 19th and 20th, pilots diving low over columns that have nowhere left to disperse, the surrounding fields offering no real cover from aircraft that can see for miles across the flat, open Norman countryside. Pilots describe roads so densely packed with vehicles that individual targets become almost impossible to distinguish. Entire convoys destroyed in a single strafing run, the surrounding fields littered with burning wreckage, and the bodies of men and animals in numbers that turn the stomachs of even hardened combat veterans who walk the ground afterward. Yet even amid this relentless bombardment, a substantial number of German soldiers, historians estimate at least 20,000, and some estimates run considerably higher, managed to escape eastward through the narrowing gap before it finally closes. Many of them experienced officers and specialized troops who will go on to help rebuild German defensive lines inside their own borders in the months that follow. The scale of destruction inside the pocket, once it finally closes, is almost impossible to overstate. When Allied forces from both directions finally meet and seal the Falaise Gap completely, they find a landscape of devastation unlike almost anything else witnessed on the Western Front. Roads and fields for miles are choked with the burned-out husks of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, the bloated bodies of thousands of dead horses baking in the August heat, and the corpses of German soldiers in numbers so overwhelming that burial details struggle for weeks afterward, simply to clear the ground. Correspondents and soldiers who tour the pocket in the days after it closes describe a stench so overpowering it can reportedly be detected by aircraft flying thousands of feet overhead, and photographs taken in the aftermath, fields carpeted with wreckage stretching to the horizon, become some of the most enduring visual records of the entire Normandy campaign, images that convey the totality of the German collapse more vividly than any casualty statistic ever could. Bulldozers requisitioned from engineering units are pressed into service for weeks afterward, digging mass graves and clearing wreckage from roads that must be reopened for the continuing Allied advance. A grim, unglamorous labor that receives none of the attention paid to the battle itself, but proves just as essential to the campaign moving forward. General Dwight Eisenhower, touring the battlefield shortly after the fighting ends, later describes it as one of the greatest killing grounds of the entire war, writing that it was possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping only on dead flesh and wreckage, without ever touching bare earth. Estimates of German losses inside the Falaise pocket vary, but the consensus among historians places the number of German soldiers killed at somewhere between 10 and 15,000, with an additional 40 to 50,000 captured, alongside the near-total destruction of the German 7th Army as a coherent fighting force, and catastrophic losses to the 5th Panzer Army as well. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, and enormous quantities of artillery and equipment are abandoned or destroyed, losses so severe that German forces retreating across France in the following weeks do so largely without the armor and heavy weapons that had, until Normandy, made the Wehrmacht such a formidable fighting force. Some German commanders who survived the pocket later describe emerging with little more than the uniforms on their backs, entire divisions reduced to a few hundred men and no heavy equipment whatsoever, forced to rebuild from almost nothing once they crossed back into German-held territory. For an army that had, only 10 weeks earlier, been defending what Hitler himself called an impregnable Atlantic wall, the transformation into a shattered, fleeing remnant, scrambling for survival across the very roads it once used to conquer France, represents one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in the entire history of modern warfare. And yet the tens of thousands who do escape represent, in the eyes of Patton and his most vocal defenders in the decades since, a lost opportunity of historic proportions. Soldiers who would go on to fight again in the Ardennes offensive that December, and in the increasingly desperate defense of Germany itself through the war's final year. The debate over Bradley's decision to halt at Argentan begins almost immediately and has never fully settled, even among historians writing decades after every participant in the argument has died. Popular accounts of the war, particularly those shaped by Patton's own outsized public persona and the mythology that grew around him in the decades following his death in a car accident in December 1945, have often leaned toward portraying the halt order as a costly, unnecessary act of caution, a narrative that, while not entirely without merit, tends to flatten the genuine operational complexity Bradley was managing in favor of a simpler story about boldness thwarted by timidity. Patton himself never forgives what he considers a catastrophic failure of nerve, writing in his own diaries and later memoirs that he was convinced his forces could have closed the gap completely, trapping the entire German force inside the pocket and potentially ending organized German resistance in France weeks earlier than actually occurred. He describes the halt order as one of the greatest missed opportunities of the entire war, a moment when caution triumphed over the kind of decisive, aggressive action he believed should define Allied strategy in a war against an enemy already reeling from catastrophic losses. In one frequently cited entry, Patton reportedly laments that he could have driven the British and Canadians back into the sea for another Dunkirk, a characteristically provocative remark, aimed less at the enemy than at what he considered the excessive caution of his own Allied command structure. In private conversations with his staff, Patton reportedly complains bitterly that Bradley's caution has cost the Allies a chance to shorten the war by months, a claim that, while impossible to verify, reflects the genuine anguish Patton felt watching German forces escape a trap he believed his tanks could have sealed. Bradley, for his part, defends the decision for the rest of his life, arguing consistently in his memoirs and public statements that the risk of a friendly fire catastrophe between converging American and Canadian forces was real and serious, and that a hasty, uncoordinated dash northward risked turning a decisive victory into a chaotic disaster that could have cost thousands of Allied lives through exactly the kind of confused, close-quarters engagement that had already proven so deadly at Saint-Lô. He points out that Hyslop's corps was already dangerously overextended, its flanks exposed, its supply lines stretched to the breaking point after days of continuous advance, and that pushing further into terrain assigned to Montgomery's forces risked not just friendly fire, but genuine tactical vulnerability if German forces had managed to organize a coordinated counterattack against an American corps operating well beyond its planned limits. Bradley also notes, in his own later writings, that he did not have reliable information at the time about precisely how quickly Canadian and Polish forces might reach Falaise from the north, an uncertainty that made the risk of American units racing into a poorly coordinated, converging battle all the more difficult to justify, given what he saw as the relatively modest additional gain of sealing the pocket a few days earlier than it was ultimately sealed. Whether this caution was the correct call, or an excess of caution that cost the Allies a more complete victory, remains one of the most contested questions of the entire Normandy campaign, debated in military academies and staff colleges for generations afterward. What is not in dispute is the strategic significance of what the Allies achieved at Falaise, even with the gap left partially open. The destruction of the German 7th Army and the crippling of the 5th Panzer Army effectively end organized German resistance in Normandy, opening the path for the rapid Allied advance across France that follows in the final 2 weeks of August 1944. Paris is liberated on August 25th, barely a week after the Falaise pocket finally closes, and Allied forces continue their advance toward the German border at a pace that, only months earlier, would have seemed impossibly optimistic to even the most confident Allied planners. Some Allied commanders, buoyed by the scale of the victory at Falaise despite its incomplete closure, briefly entertain hopes that the war in Europe might be won before the end of 1944, a hope that will be dashed within months by the logistical strain of supplying such a rapid advance, and, ultimately, by the German counter-offensive in the Ardennes that December. The Normandy campaign, which began with the D-Day landings on June 6th and ground through 7 brutal weeks of hedgerow fighting before Operation Cobra's breakout, ultimately costs Germany an estimated 400,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, captured, and missing, along with the near-total loss of the armored and mechanized forces that had, at the campaign's outset, represented some of the most formidable military power Germany could field in the West. Allied casualties across the same 3-month campaign are also severe, numbering well over 200,000 killed, wounded, and missing among American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces, a reminder that even history's most celebrated victories carry an enormous human cost on every side of the fighting. Set against that broader ledger of loss, the specific question of how many additional German soldiers might have been trapped had Bradley approved Patton's request represents only a fraction of the campaign's total toll, and yet it is precisely this narrower, more personal question, tied to a single command decision, made in a matter of hours, that continues to generate more sustained historical argument than almost any other episode of the entire summer. The soldiers who escape through the Falaise Gap, however, do not simply vanish from the war. Many of the experienced officers and specialized troops who slip east before the pocket finally closes go on to form the nucleus of German defensive efforts inside their own borders in the months that follow, contributing to the ferocity of the fighting Allied forces encounter in the Hürtgen forest that autumn, and, most consequentially, to the German build-up that produces the surprise Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, in which German forces, including remnants of units that escaped Falaise, mount one final, desperate counter-offensive that costs the United States Army more casualties than any other single battle of the entire war. Historians tracing the lineage of specific German units that fought in the Ardennes have identified several formations, including elements of panzer divisions that had been badly mauled but not entirely destroyed at Falaise, rebuilt with fresh replacements and equipment in the intervening months, suggesting a direct, traceable line between the soldiers who escaped the gap in August and the surprise offensive that catches American forces off guard 4 months later. Whether a fully closed gap at Falaise in mid-August could have prevented that offensive entirely remains one of the great, unanswerable questions of the war, a hypothetical that historians continue to wrestle with, precisely because Bradley's decision on August 13th left the question permanently, agonizingly open. For Bradley personally, the decision at Argentan becomes, alongside his handling of the Saint-Lô bombing weeks earlier, one of the defining and most scrutinized moments of his entire military career, a choice made under enormous pressure, with imperfect information, weighing the very real risk of friendly fire catastrophe against the tantalizing possibility of a more complete victory. Eisenhower himself, reviewing the decision in the years after the war, generally supports Bradley's caution, noting the genuine operational hazards of the converging advance, while also acknowledging, with the benefit of hindsight unavailable to any commander in the moment, that a more completely sealed pocket would likely have shortened the war by some measure, even if the exact scale of that difference can never be precisely calculated. This kind of qualified, two-sided assessment, acknowledging both the soundness of Bradley's reasoning and the real cost of the opportunity left on the table, comes to typify how most serious historians eventually approach the controversy, resisting the temptation to declare either Patton or Bradley simply right or simply wrong. It is the kind of decision that reveals something essential about the nature of command itself, that even a general standing at the height of Allied success, commanding armies that have just achieved one of the most dramatic battlefield collapses inflicted on the German military in the entire war, must still choose between the security of caution and the promise of a bolder, riskier stroke, and that history rarely offers a clean verdict on which choice was truly correct. Patton wanted the kill shot. Bradley chose the safer trap. Somewhere in the gap between those two instincts, tens of thousands of German soldiers walked free, carrying the war forward into another winter, another battle, another reckoning still to come, a reminder that even the most decisive victories in war are rarely as complete as the men who win them wish they could be.